There's no easy way of measuring disasters. Death tolls, environmental damage, recovery costs, and more all help quantify great tragedies. Disasters caused by war only further complicate the question, and those have been excluded. With all these factors in mind, we present 10 of the worst man-made disasters in history. The meltdown at the nuclear power facility in Chernobyl, Ukraine in 1986 is possibly the worst man-made disaster in history. It's the world's worst nuclear accident. It's the world's most expensive accident. It left a 30-mile exclusion zone poisoned for the next 20,000 years. While only 31 people were initially killed, thousands more have died from the long-term effects of radiation exposure. Moreover, it caused many disfiguring and debilitating mutations in children. Millions of people were impacted by the disaster. That famous London fog wasn't fog at all, rather, it was smog. London factories expelled so much pollution, it left a grimy residue on everything. On bad days, thick clouds of smog could obscure vision, leaving a brown haze over the city. On the worst days, it killed people. The absolute worst occurrence was the Great Smog in 1952. Reports at the time put the death toll at 4,000, but more recent studies suggest that the number may have been more like 12,000. In 1984, a pesticide plant in Bhopal, India leaked large quantities of methyl isocyanate gas, as well as other highly toxic chemicals. The gases were heavier than air. Rather than dispersing into the atmosphere, they stayed low to the ground, flooding nearby shanty towns. The official death toll is almost 4,000. However, others have suggested that as many as 8,000 victims died within 2 weeks, and another 8,000 have died since. 170,000 people were treated but survived. In 1626, an explosion at the Wanggongchang gunpowder factory in Beijing killed 20,000 people and damaged a large portion of the city. The blast was heard over 100 miles away, and it flung debris 20 miles. What ignited the explosion has been highly debated. People have suggested meteor strikes, natural gas explosions, earthquakes, tornadoes, underground volcanoes, and more. In 2010, the Deepwater Horizon oil rig exploded. For the next 87 days, the underwater well dumped 212 million gallons of crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico. It directly impacted 68,000 square miles of ocean, comparable to the size of Oklahoma. The environmental impact was immense. Millions of pounds of oily material was deposited on beaches. Marine animals died at record rates as they were directly poisoned or their habitat was destroyed. The companies involved have paid tens of billions of dollars in fines, restitution, and cleanup costs to date. At least the Deepwater disaster was accidental. During the Persian Gulf War in 1991, Saddam Hussein deliberately dumped roughly hundreds of millions of gallons of crude oil into the Persian Gulf, covering the 40,000 square miles of water with 5 inches of crude. The leak was meant to keep U.S. forces from landing on Iraq's coast or commandeering the oil for themselves. In addition, Iraqi forces set fire to about 700 oil wells in Kuwait. The fires took more than 6 months to extinguish. The freshwater Aral Sea was once the 4th largest lake in the world. Today, it is 10% of its former size. In the 1960s, the Soviet Union redirected the 2 rivers feeding the sea into the desert in an attempt to create more farmland. Not only did this destroy the sea, but it wasn't even particularly effective, as somewhere between 30% and 75% of the water escaped the irrigation system through evaporation and leakage. Agricultural runoff polluted the sea, and evaporation caused salt content to increase. Desert has taken much of the land that was once the Aral Sea. The sand is also polluted, which people and animals breathe when the wind makes it airborne. The Prestige oil tanker began leaking fuel oil after a storm in 2002. Fearing for their safety and needing to address the damage, the crew searched for a port. Spanish, Portuguese, and French authorities all turned them away. 6 days after the storm, the ship split into 2, gushing oil. After sinking, it continued to leak. In total, about 20 million gallons were spilled. The wreck continues to leak at a slower rate, and the hull is degrading. In ancient Rome, every major city had an amphitheater. In the city of Fidense, as the stadium filled to capacity for gladiatorial games, after the ban had been recently lifted, the stadium collapsed. One ancient source puts the fatalities at 20,000, another claimed 50,000 dead and wounded. Even with granting some of the pretty wide margins, it's the worst stadium disaster in history. The Citarum River in Indonesia is arguably the world's most polluted river, bearing high levels of mercury, arsenic, and other toxins. Lead levels can be as much as 1,000 times greater than EPA standards. The sources are thousands of the factories which dump toxic waste into the water. In addition, the surface of the water is completely obscured by floating domestic waste such as plastic items and packaging material. 5 million people live in the river basin, and another 25 million are dependent on the river in some way, using it for drinking, bathing, or agriculture.